In a sterile high-rise office building in suburban Ohio, a quiet and exhausted project manager was about to confront the system that had discarded her. What started as a routine HR check-in took a shocking turn when she came face-to-face with a cruel ultimatum masked in corporate jargon. Grace Holloway wasn't your typical tech worker. For over a decade, she had carved her place in a male-dominated firm, known for her relentless work ethic and calm under pressure. She'd led teams through impossible deadlines until her own body became the deadline she couldn't push. When she encountered a company email citing excessive absenteeism just weeks into chemotherapy, she had no idea she was walking into a legal firestorm. Grace made a decision in that moment that would lead to a courtroom reckoning with national consequences. What began as a woman quietly fighting for her life would become a landmark legal battle that redefined employee rights. The corporate tech sector would never be the same after Grace Holloway dared to speak, to sue, and to win. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Martinez's office hummed with the same mechanical persistence that had carried Grace Holloway through the past 3 months of deadline-driven nights and caffeine-fueled mornings. She sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair, her phone buzzing incessantly in her purse, probably updates from the Meridian project launch that had consumed her life for the better part of a year. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was finally here, in this sterile medical office, because she'd finally run out of excuses to ignore the persistent ache in her left breast that had been whispering warnings she'd been too busy to hear. Stage 2 invasive ductal carcinoma, Dr. Martinez said, his voice steady and clinical, as if he were reading quarterly projections rather than reshaping the trajectory of her life. The tumor is approximately 3 centimeters, and we've detected involvement in 2 nearby lymph nodes. Grace's fingers found the fabric of her navy blazer, the same one she'd worn to present the final Meridian deliverables just 48 hours ago. The presentation had been flawless, standing ovations from the executive team. Bryce Calloway himself had pulled her aside afterward, his usually composed demeanor cracking into something approaching genuine warmth as he'd told her she was exactly the kind of leader Technova needs more of. The promotion rumors had been swirling ever since. Now, sitting in this beige-walled office that smelled of antiseptic and resignation, those same fingers traced the blazer's buttons as Dr. Martinez continued explaining treatment protocols and survival statistics. His words washed over her like white noise: chemotherapy, radiation, surgical options, while her mind performed the same analytical calculations that had made her indispensable at Technova. Project timelines, resource allocation, risk mitigation strategies. "What's the timeline?" she heard herself ask, interrupting his explanation of hormone therapy. "I mean, for treatment. How long are we talking?" Dr. Martinez paused, his pen hovering over her chart. "We're looking at approximately 6 months of chemotherapy, followed by surgery, then potentially 6 weeks of radiation. The exact schedule will depend on how you respond to 6 months. The words escaped her lips as a whisper. 6 months. The Meridian project had taken 8 months from conception to launch, and that had nearly killed her. But this was different. This was her body betraying the same meticulous planning and relentless drive that had built her career. "Grace." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, his voice gentling in a way that made her chest tighten with something that wasn't cancer. "I know this is overwhelming, but the survival rates for stage 2 breast cancer are very encouraging. With aggressive treatment, we're looking at a 90% 5-year survival rate." 90%. In the corporate world, those were excellent odds. But sitting here, staring at the medical degree on his wall while her phone continued its insistent buzzing, Grace realized that surviving wasn't the same as living. It wasn't the same as maintaining the trajectory she'd spent her entire adult life building. "I need to work," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out with an urgency that surprised even her. I mean, I can work during treatment, right? I have projects, responsibilities. People are counting on me. The look that crossed Dr. Martinez's face was one she'd seen before, usually on the faces of her team members when she'd suggest working through lunch or staying late to perfect a presentation that was already good enough. It was concern-wrapped. In professional courtesy, the kind of gentle skepticism that came from watching people push themselves past their breaking points. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said carefully. "Some patients do maintain modified work schedules during treatment, but you'll need to be flexible. Chemotherapy affects everyone differently, and your body will be fighting on multiple fronts." Grace nodded, already mentally drafting the email she'd send to HR. She'd frame it professionally, of course. A temporary medical situation requiring some schedule adjustments. Nothing that would compromise her position or the confidence the executive team had placed in her. She'd seen colleagues disappear into the corporate ether after prolonged medical leaves, reassigned to lesser roles, quietly pushed aside as the machinery of business moved forward without them. The drive back to Technova's gleaming headquarters gave her time to construct the narrative. 34 minutes of Sacramento traffic, windows up, air conditioning battling the September heat while she rehearsed the conversation she'd have with Bryce. Professional, confident, inconvenient, but manageable. The Technova building rose from the suburban landscape like a monument to Silicon Valley ambition, all glass and steel angles designed to project innovation and growth. Grace had always found comfort in its clean lines and purposeful architecture. Unlike the chaos of startup culture she'd escaped years ago, Technova represented stability, structure, the kind of corporate environment where hard work and intelligence were rewarded with advancement and security. She found Bryce in his corner office, tie loosened after what she knew had been a day of back-to-back meetings with the board. At 42, he embodied the polished professionalism that Technova cultivated. Harvard MBA, perfectly styled salt and pepper, hair, the kind of measured confidence that came from years of climbing corporate ladders. He looked up from his laptop when she knocked on his open door, his expression shifting from distracted productivity to focused attention. "Grace. Perfect. Timing. I was just reviewing the Meridian post-mortem reports. The client feedback has been phenomenal. We're looking at a potential contract extension worth—" He stopped mid-sentence, his executive instincts apparently registering something in her expression. "Everything okay?" She settled into the chair across from his desk, the same chair, where she'd received praise, promotions, and increasingly challenging assignments over her 5 years at Technova. The late afternoon sun streamed through his floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the conference table where she'd presented countless project updates. "I need to let you know about a medical situation," she began, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I've been diagnosed with breast cancer, stage 2. My doctor says the prognosis is very good with treatment, but I'll need some flexibility in my schedule over the next several months." Bryce's expression shifted. Through a series of micro-expressions, surprise, concern, and something else she couldn't quite identify. He set down his pen with deliberate care, his executive mask sliding into place. "Grace, I'm so sorry. That's terrible news." He paused, seeming to search for the appropriate corporate response to human catastrophe. Of course we'll support you through this. Technova has excellent benefits, and we'll make sure you get the care you need." "I want to be clear," Grace said quickly. "I'm not talking about extended leave. I can maintain my current responsibilities with some accommodation for treatment schedules, chemotherapy appointments, things like that. My doctor says many patients continue working." Relief flickered across Bryce's features, subtle but unmistakable. That's great to hear, Grace. Really. Your dedication is exactly why you're so valuable to this team." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in a gesture she recognized as his problem-solving pose. "We'll need to loop in HR, of course. Document everything properly. But I want you to know that your position here is secure. We've invested too much in your development to let a temporary medical situation derail your career. Temporary medical situation. The phrase hung in the air between them, sanitized and manageable. Grace felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. This was the response she'd hoped for. Practical, supportive, professional. The kind of corporate pragmatism that had made Technova a leader in their sector. Thank you, Bryce. That means everything. To me. Let's get you connected with Jennifer in HR tomorrow. She'll walk you through the process, make sure all your benefits are optimized. He glanced at his laptop screen, where she could see the glow of incoming emails. And Grace? Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. We're here for you. The conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but as Grace walked back to her office through the familiar maze of open-concept workstations and collaborative spaces, she felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The relief was obvious. Her job was safe, her career trajectory intact. But the unease lingered, a nagging sense that something in Bryce's reaction hadn't quite aligned with his words. Her phone buzzed as she reached her desk, and she glanced down to see a text from Tasha. How did it go? Call me when you can. Tasha Bennett had been Grace's anchor since childhood, the kind of friend who showed up without being asked and stayed without being thanked. As an oncology nurse at UC Davis Medical Center, she'd been the one to finally convince Grace to get the lump checked after months of dismissive self-diagnosis. It's probably nothing, Grace had insisted right up until the moment Dr. Martinez had used the word malignant. Grace gathered her things, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the 12-hour days she'd been pulling to finish the Meridian project. The office around her hummed with its usual late-afternoon energy. Developers debugging code, project managers updating timelines, sales teams closing deals. The steady rhythm of corporate productivity that had been her comfort zone for so long now felt strangely foreign, as if she were watching it from behind glass. She drove home to her modest 2-bedroom house in Midtown Sacramento, the same house she'd bought 3 years ago when her promotion to senior project manager had finally made home ownership possible. It was a symbol of stability, of the life she'd built through careful planning and relentless work. The mortgage payments were manageable, the commute reasonable, the neighborhood safe and quiet. Tasha was waiting on her front porch, 2 cups of coffee from their favorite cafe balanced in her hands. At 34, she carried herself with the calm competence that came from years of helping people navigate their worst days. Her dark hair was pulled back in the practical ponytail she wore for 12-hour shifts, her scrubs traded for jeans and a UC Davis sweatshirt. You look like hell, Tasha said without preamble, handing Grace one of the cups. Thanks. That's exactly what every newly diagnosed cancer patient wants to hear. They settled on the porch swing Grace had installed the previous spring, a small indulgence that had felt like a symbol of putting down roots. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine from her neighbor's garden, the same peaceful suburban soundtrack that had drawn her to this neighborhood. Tell me about the appointment, Tasha said, her voice carrying the professional calm that made her so effective with patients. All of it. Grace recounted Dr. Martinez's findings, the treatment timeline, the statistics and protocols. Tasha listened without interruption, her expression shifting into the focused attention Grace had seen her use with families receiving devastating news. 6 months of chemo is standard for your staging, Tasha said when Grace finished. Dr. Martinez is good, one of the best oncologists in the region. You're in excellent hands. I told Bryce today about the diagnosis. How did that go? Grace took a sip of her coffee, trying to process the conversation. Good, I think. He was supportive, said my job is secure, that they'd work with me on scheduling. Tasha was quiet for a long moment, watching the evening light fade across Grace's small front yard. Grace, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Okay. Are you planning to work through treatment? Of course. I mean, with accommodations for appointments and… No. Tasha turned to face her fully, her expression serious. I'm not talking about accommodations. I'm talking about maintaining your current workload, your current stress levels, your current pace. Are you planning to treat this like a minor inconvenience that you can manage around your career? Grace felt her defenses rising, the same protective instinct that had carried her through years of corporate challenges. Tasha, I can't just disappear for 6 months. I have responsibilities, projects that depend on me. The Meridian extension, alone. Grace. Tasha's voice was gentle but firm. I've been doing this for 8 years. I've seen hundreds of patients try to maintain their normal lives during treatment. Some succeed, some don't. But the ones who do succeed are the ones who understand that their body is about to become their full-time job. I'm not like other patients. I'm stronger than... Stop. Tasha reached over and took Grace's hand, her fingers warm and steady. Listen to me. You are not stronger than cancer. You are not more disciplined than chemotherapy. You are not more organized than your body's immune system fighting for its life. The words hit Grace like a physical blow, stripping away the careful rationalization she'd been building since leaving Dr. Martinez's office. For the first time since hearing her diagnosis, she felt the full weight of what was coming, not as a project to be managed, but as a battle to be fought. I'm scared, she whispered, the admission feeling like a confession. Good, Tasha said, squeezing her hand. Fear keeps you smart. Fear keeps you alive. They sat in silence as darkness settled over the neighborhood, the porch light casting a warm circle around them. Grace's mind raced through the implications of what Tasha had said, the possibility that her carefully constructed life might be about to change in ways she couldn't control or manage. Her phone buzzed with another work email, and for the first time in years, she didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she sat with her oldest friend on the porch swing she'd bought to celebrate putting down roots, watching the stars emerge in the Sacramento sky, and wondering if the life she'd built was strong enough to survive what was coming. Tomorrow, she would call HR and begin the process of documenting her condition. She would schedule her first chemotherapy session for the following week, carefully planned around her existing project deadlines. She would maintain her professional composure and her corporate responsibilities, because that was who Grace Holloway had always been, the woman who got things done, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. But tonight, sitting in the gathering darkness with Tasha's words echoing in her mind, she allowed herself to feel the first crack in the armor she'd spent years building, the first whisper of doubt about whether strength and determination would be enough to carry her through what was coming. The stars overhead were indifferent to her plans, her fears, her carefully managed life. Like the cancer growing in her body, they followed their own timeline, their own logic, their own inexorable path forward. Grace closed her eyes and listened to the quiet sounds of her neighborhood, distant television shows, the hum of air conditioners, the ordinary rhythm of lives continuing their steady march toward tomorrow. In 12 hours, she would be back at Technova, managing projects and attending meetings and maintaining the professional facade that had become her identity. But the woman sitting on this porch swing was different from the one who had walked into Dr. Martinez's office that morning. Changed in ways she was only beginning to understand, carrying knowledge that would reshape everything she thought she knew about strength, control, and what it meant to fight for her life. The fluorescent lights in Grace's office felt different now, their harsh glare exposing every shadow under her eyes as she stared at her laptop screen. 3 weeks into chemotherapy, and the Meridian contract extension documents blurred together, like watercolors in rain. She'd been at her desk since 7 a.m., trying to catch up on the work that had piled up during Tuesday's treatment session, but her concentration fractured every few minutes. Her phone buzzed, another client email marked urgent. Grace reached for it, then stopped as a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. The anti-nausea medication Dr. Martinez had prescribed helped, but it couldn't completely silence her body's rebellion against the poison designed to save her life. Grace? Bryce appeared in her doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Do you have a minute?" She minimized her email and gestured to the chair across from her desk, the same chair where colleagues came to discuss project timelines and budget allocations. But something in Bryce's posture suggested this wasn't about deliverables. "I wanted to check in on how you're managing everything," he said, settling into the chair with corporate precision. "Jennifer from HR mentioned you've missed several client calls this week." Grace's fingers found her blazer button, a nervous habit she'd developed since treatment began. "The chemotherapy schedule is still being adjusted. Dr. Martinez said the first few cycles are about finding the right balance of medications." Of course. Bryce nodded, but his eyes flickered to the stack of project folders on her desk, work that should have been completed days ago. "The thing is, Grace, the Meridian client specifically asked about project continuity. They're concerned about consistency in communication." The words hit her like a physical blow. Consistency, communication. Corporate euphemisms for reliability, for being the kind of employee who never let personal problems interfere with business objectives. The kind of employee Grace had always been, until cancer had made her inconveniently human. "I can handle the Meridian extension," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I just need a few more days to get back up to speed." Bryce leaned forward, his expression shifting into what she recognized as his problem-solving mode. "What if we brought Hannah Wu onto the team? Just as backup support. She's sharp, eager to prove herself. It would take some pressure off you." Hannah Wu, the recent law school graduate who'd been making impressive contributions to their legal compliance reviews. Grace had noticed her in meetings, quiet, intelligent, hungry for advancement. The kind of eager junior associate Grace had been 5 years ago. "That's not necessary," Grace said quickly. "I can manage my workload." "I know you can," Bryce replied, but his tone carried the careful diplomacy of a manager delivering unwelcome news. "It's just that we need to think strategically about resource allocation. Your health has to be the priority, but the business can't pause while you recover." The business can't pause. The phrase hung between them like a verdict, polite, but immutable. Grace understood the subtext. She was becoming a liability, a disruption to the smooth operation of corporate machinery. The woman who had once been indispensable was now inconvenient. After Bryce left, Grace sat alone in her office, staring at the framed photo on her desk, herself and her team celebrating the successful launch of the Morrison project 6 months ago. Everyone smiling, champagne glasses raised, the easy camaraderie of shared victory. She barely recognized the woman in the photo, so confident and vibrant, unaware that her body was already betraying her. Her computer chimed with a new email, this one from Jennifer in HR. "Grace, please see attached absence tracking report for review. Let's schedule a meeting to discuss accommodations moving forward." The attachment showed a spreadsheet with clinical precision, dates missed, hours, absent project impacts. Her life reduced to metrics, her illness quantified in terms of corporate inconvenience. She'd become a problem to be managed, a risk to be mitigated. Grace closed her laptop and gathered her things, suddenly exhausted by the effort of pretending. Everything was normal. As she walked through the office toward the elevator, she caught fragments of conversation from her colleagues, project deadlines, client presentations, the ordinary rhythm of professional life continuing without pause. The parking garage was cool and quiet, offering temporary refuge from the performance of corporate normalcy. Grace sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine, her hands shaking from fatigue and something deeper, the growing realization that the life she'd built might not survive what was coming. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tasha. "How was today? Call me if you need to talk." Grace stared at the message, remembering her friend's words about the body becoming a full-time job. She was beginning to understand what Tasha had meant, not just the physical demands of treatment, but the way illness exposed the fragility of everything she'd thought was secure. Tomorrow, she would return to her desk and fight to maintain her professional facade. She would manage projects and attend meetings and prove that Grace Holloway was still the reliable, indispensable employee TreatmentThen had invested in. But tonight, driving home through Sacramento traffic while her body processed chemotherapy and her mind processed corporate mathematics, she felt the ground shifting beneath everything she'd built. The metrics didn't lie. She was becoming absent, unreliable, inconvenient. And in the ruthless arithmetic of corporate survival, that might be all that mattered. The email arrived at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday, while Grace was curled on her couch, recovering from her third chemotherapy session. She'd been drifting in and out of sleep, her body heavy with the chemical fatigue that had become her new normal, when her phone chimed with a message marked, "Urgent HR communication." Her fingers felt clumsy as she opened the email, the screen swimming slightly as the anti-nausea medication played havoc with her vision. The subject line was corporate sterile. Employment status update, immediate action required. Dear Ms. Holloway, after careful review of your attendance records and performance metrics over the past 6 weeks, TreatmentThen has made the difficult decision to terminate your employment effective immediately due to excessive absenteeism and inability to fulfill essential job functions, per Company Policy Section 4.2.7. Employees who miss more than 30% of scheduled work hours over a consecutive 4-week period may be subject to termination for cause. Your recent attendance patterns fall significantly outside acceptable parameters. Your final paycheck will be processed according to standard procedures. Information regarding Cobra Healthcare continuation coverage will be mailed separately. Please arrange to return all company property by close of business Friday. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Jennifer Walsh, Director of Human Resources. Grace read the email 3 times, each pass making the words more surreal and devastating. Excessive absenteeism, essential job functions, termination for cause. The clinical language couldn't disguise what had just happened. TreatmentThen had discarded her the moment she became inconvenient. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through. Her phone, looking for Bryce's number. Surely this was a mistake. Surely the man who had praised her dedication just weeks ago wouldn't let HR destroy her career while she was fighting for her life. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. On the 3rd attempt, his assistant answered with practiced corporate courtesy. I'm sorry, Ms. Holloway, but Mr. Calloway is in meetings for the remainder of the day. I can schedule you for next week if... Next week? Grace's voice cracked. I've been terminated. I need to speak with him now. A pause. I see. Let me check his calendar again. The hold music was a cheerful instrumental that felt like mockery. When the assistant returned, her voice had shifted to the tone reserved for former employees and other corporate inconveniences. I'm sorry, but Mr. Calloway's schedule is completely booked. Perhaps you could reach out to HR directly with any questions about your situation. Grace ended the call and stared at her phone, the reality settling over her like concrete. She'd been erased. 5 years of 60-hour weeks, of projects delivered ahead of schedule, of quarterly reviews praising her as indispensable. None of it mattered now that she'd become a liability. Her doorbell rang, startling her from her shock. Through the peephole, she saw Eli, her younger brother, holding 2 bags of groceries and wearing the concerned expression he'd carried since her diagnosis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Grace? He knocked gently. I brought soup. That fancy organic stuff you pretend not to like. She opened the door, and whatever composed mask she'd been wearing crumbled at the sight of his worried face. Eli dropped the groceries and pulled her into a hug that smelled like his cologne and the recording studio where he spent most of his days chasing dreams of musical stardom. Jesus, Grace, you look like hell. Did something happen? Is it the chemo? They fired me, she whispered against his shoulder. They actually fired me. Eli pulled back, his expression shifting from concern to fury. At 29, he'd inherited their mother's quick temper along with her artistic sensibilities, and Grace watched both ignite in his dark eyes. They what? While you're sick? While you're in fucking treatment? Excessive absenteeism, Grace said, the corporate phrase tasting bitter. Inability to fulfill essential job functions. That's illegal. That has to be illegal. Grace sank onto her couch, exhaustion replacing shock. I don't know. Maybe. Probably. I can't think straight right now. Eli paced her small living room like a caged animal, his musician's hands gesturing wildly. This is insane. You've given them everything. You worked Christmas last year. You worked through that stomach flu that knocked out half the office. That was different, Grace said quietly. I was valuable then. You're valuable now. No. The word came out flat, definitive. I'm expensive now. I'm unreliable. I'm a risk to their precious productivity metrics. Eli stopped pacing and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. Grace, listen to me. This isn't about your value. This is about them being soulless corporate assholes who see employees as expendable resources. Grace wanted to argue, to defend the company. That had been her professional home for 5 years. But the email on her phone told a different story, a story where human beings became problems to be solved, where illness was treated as a character flaw rather than a medical crisis. I don't know what to do, she admitted. The COBRA payments alone will eat through my savings in months. And who's going to hire someone mid-chemotherapy? Eli was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his own phone. Tasha mentioned something about a lawyer, someone who handles cases like this. Cases like what? Discrimination, medical discrimination. He was already scrolling through his contacts. His name is Jonas something. Jonas Price. Tasha says he used to work for big corporations, but now he goes after them. Grace felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, or might have been desperate anger. I can't afford a lawyer, Eli. Most of these guys work on contingency. They only get paid if you win. He found the number and showed her the screen. What? Have you got to lose? Everything, Grace thought. Her health, her career, her carefully constructed life. But then she looked at the email again, at the cold dismissal of 5 years of dedication, and felt something harder than hope crystallize in her chest. Rage. Call him, she said. Eli grinned, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since her diagnosis. There's my sister. As he dialed, Grace stared out her living room window at the suburban street where she'd imagined building a stable, predictable life. The house across the street had a for sale sign, and she wondered absently if the owners were also dealing with some corporate calculation that had rendered their dreams unaffordable. Her phone chimed with another email, this one from IT, informing her that her system access had been revoked. They were methodical. She had to give them that. Clean, efficient, corporate. But as Eli spoke to Jonas Price's receptionist, scheduling an appointment for the following week, Grace felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in years of climbing corporate ladders. The desire to fight back not for advancement or recognition, but for justice. Technova had made a calculation that Grace Holloway was no longer worth the inconvenience she represented. They had reduced her humanity to metrics, her illness to absenteeism, her fight for life to a failure of essential job functions. It was time to show them the cost of that calculation. The conversation with Jonas Price would change everything, though Grace didn't know it yet. Sitting on her couch while Eli arranged her first act of rebellion, she was still thinking like the corporate professional she'd been trained to be, strategic, careful, risk-averse. But the woman who would walk into Jonas Price's office the following week would be someone different. Someone who had learned that when the system fails you, You have to be willing to challenge the system itself. The termination notice glowed. On her phone screen, a corporate death certificate for the life she'd built. But it was also something else. Evidence. Proof. The beginning of a case that would expose the human cost of treating people like expendable resources. Grace closed the email and reached for the soup Eli had brought, her appetite returning for the first time in days. Tomorrow, she would begin the fight of her life. Tonight, she would rest and plan and prepare for war. Jonas Price's law office occupied the third floor of a converted Victorian in downtown Sacramento. Its narrow hallways and creaking hardwood floors a stark contrast to Technova's sterile corporate aesthetic. Grace climbed the stairs slowly, her body still recovering from Thursday's chemotherapy session, while Eli provided steady support at her elbow. The nameplate on the frosted glass door read, Price and Associates, Civil Rights Law, in simple black lettering. No corporate branding, no mission statements about excellence and innovation. Just a promise of advocacy written in fading gold leaf. You sure about this guy? Grace asked, pausing outside the door. Tasha says he's a bulldog, Eli replied. Used to work for the enemy. Now he fights them. The receptionist, a woman, in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up from her computer as they entered. Ms. Holloway, Mr. Price is ready for you. Jonas Price was not what Grace had expected. Tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he looked more like a college professor than a courtroom warrior. His office was cluttered with legal texts, case files, and what appeared to be several half-finished cups of coffee. A framed photo on his desk showed a younger version of himself in an expensive suit, shaking hands with men in similar corporate uniforms. Please sit, he said, gesturing to two worn leather chairs across from his desk. His voice carried a slight rasp, as if he'd spent years arguing in courtrooms or smoking too many cigarettes during late-night case preparation. Grace settled into the chair, placing the manila folder containing her employment records on her lap. She'd spent the weekend organizing everything: performance reviews, project commendations, the termination email, medical documentation from Dr. Martinez. The same meticulous preparation that had made her successful at Technova, now repurposed for warfare. Tell me what happened, Jonas said simply. Grace began with her diagnosis, the conversation with Bryce, the gradual erosion of support as her treatment progressed. Jonas listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she reached the termination email, he held out his hand. May I? She passed him her phone, watching his expression darken as he read the corporate language that had destroyed her life. His jaw tightened, and she caught a glimpse of the anger that Tasha had promised lurked beneath his professional demeanor. 30% absenteeism, he said, looking up from the screen. Over 4 weeks. How many days of work did you actually miss? Grace consulted her records. 12 days, total, over 6 weeks of treatment. And how many of those were scheduled medical appointments? All of them. Every absence was related to chemotherapy or follow-up care. I documented everything. With HR. Jonas leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in a gesture that reminded Grace uncomfortably of Bryce. But where her former boss had used the pose to project corporate authority, Jonas seemed to be calculating angles of attack. Grace, I need to ask you something directly. Are you prepared for what this kind of lawsuit entails? We're not just talking about getting your job back. We're talking about exposing systematic discrimination, challenging corporate policies, potentially years of litigation. I just want justice, Grace said quietly. Justice is expensive. It's emotionally brutal. It requires you to become a public figure, to have your medical records scrutinized, your personal life dissected. Jonas removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. Corporate defense attorneys will paint you as a disgruntled employee looking for a payday. They'll argue that your illness made you legitimately unable to perform your job functions. Eli leaned forward. But that's exactly the kind of discrimination the ADA is supposed to prevent, right? Jonas smiled, the first genuine warmth Grace had seen from him. Exactly. The Americans with Disabilities Act specifically prohibits employment. Discrimination based on disability and requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations. He replaced his glasses and pulled a thick legal tome from his shelf. Your case has several strong elements. Clear documentation of excellent performance prior to diagnosis. Immediate degradation of treatment after disclosure. Termination, timing that coincides directly with medical treatment. So you think we have a case? Grace asked. I think we have a damn good case. Jonas opened the legal text to a marked page. But I need you to understand something. Technova isn't going to roll over. They'll claim your absences created legitimate business hardship. They'll argue that accommodating your treatment schedule was unreasonable. They'll produce metrics showing productivity decline. Grace felt her professional instincts bristling. My productivity was affected by chemotherapy, but I was still meeting deadlines. The Meridian Project. Stop. Jonas held up a hand. That's exactly the trap they want you to fall into. This isn't about whether you were productive enough while fighting cancer. It's about whether they had the legal right to fire you for having cancer at all. The distinction hit Grace like a revelation. For weeks, she'd been internalizing Technova's narrative, that she'd somehow failed by becoming sick, that she'd let the team down by needing treatment. Jonas was reframing the entire conflict. The ADA doesn't require you to be superhuman, he continued. It requires employers to make reasonable accommodations for medical conditions. Flexible scheduling for chemotherapy appointments isn't just reasonable. It's basic human decency. Grace opened her manila folder and pulled out her performance reviews. 5 years of excellent ratings, 2 promotions, project leadership on their biggest accounts. Jonas flipped through the documents, his expression growing more interested. This is good. This establishes a pattern of valued employment that was disrupted solely by your medical diagnosis. He looked up at her. Grace, I want to take your case, but I need to know you're committed to seeing it through. What does that mean practically? It means depositions, court appearances, media attention. It means Technova's attorneys will try to break you down, make you seem unreliable, emotional, litigious. Jonas leaned forward. And it means potentially setting precedent that could help thousands of other workers facing similar discrimination. Grace thought about the email from HR, the clinical dismissal of 5 years of dedication. She thought about Bryce's carefully neutral expression when discussing her situation. She thought about the other employees who might be sitting in similar chairs, wondering if their humanity was worth less than corporate convenience. I'm in, she said. Jonas smiled again, this time with something that looked like anticipation. Good. Because I've been waiting for a case like this. A plaintiff, like you. He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. First, we file a complaint with the EEOC. That's required before we can proceed with federal court. Then we start building the case. How long does this take? Months, possibly years. But Grace? Jonas looked up from his notes. Technova made a mistake. They documented everything, corporate efficiency working against them for once. As they discussed retainer agreements and legal strategy, Grace felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since her diagnosis, she wasn't reacting to circumstances beyond her control. She was choosing to fight back. The woman who had walked into Dr. Martinez's office 6 weeks ago had been focused on managing her illness around her career. The woman sitting in Jonas Price's cluttered office was preparing to make her illness the foundation for challenging an entire system. One more thing, Jonas said as they prepared to leave. You should know that there's a junior associate at Technova's legal department, Hannah Wu. She might be worth watching. Grace frowned. Hannah? She's just a recent grad, barely involved in major decisions. Recent grads see things differently. They haven't been fully indoctrinated into corporate culture yet. Jonas's expression was knowing. Sometimes they still remember that laws are supposed to protect people, not just profits. Walking down the Victorian's narrow staircase, Grace felt the weight of commitment settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just a cancer patient trying to survive treatment. She was a plaintiff preparing for war. The legal battle ahead would test everything she thought she knew about justice, corporate loyalty, and her own strength. But for the first time since receiving that devastating email, Grace Holloway felt like she had a weapon to fight back. Outside on the Sacramento street, Eli squeezed her shoulder. "How do you feel?" Grace looked back at the converted Victorian, at the simple nameplate promising civil rights advocacy, and thought about Technova's gleaming headquarters across town. "Dangerous," she said. The notification on Grace's phone came at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after filing her EEOC complaint. She was sitting in Dr. Martinez's waiting room, preparing for her 6th chemotherapy session, when Eli's text arrived with a screenshot and 4 words. "We made the news." The Sacramento Bee's headline read, "Tech worker sues company after cancer. Termination." Below it, a smaller subhead, "Technova faces federal discrimination charges." Grace stared at the screen, her stomach churning with something that had nothing to do with pre-chemo anxiety. Seeing her story reduced to a headline made it feel simultaneously more real and completely surreal, like watching her life become someone else's news. Her phone buzzed with another text, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Holloway, this is Marina Campos from the Sacramento Disability Rights Coalition. I'd like to discuss your case. Are you available to talk?" Before Grace could process the message fully, her phone rang. Jonas Price's name appeared on the screen. "Have you seen the article?" he asked without preamble. "Just now." "How did they—" "Court filings are public record. Reporters monitor them for stories like this." His voice carried a mix of satisfaction and warning. "The good news is that the coverage is sympathetic. The bad news is that you're about to become a public figure." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of unwanted attention settling on her shoulders. "What does that mean?" "It means more reporters will call. It means Technova's PR department is probably in crisis mode right now. And it means other people in similar situations might reach out to you." As if summoned by his words, Grace's phone displayed 3 missed calls and 5 unread emails. The quiet anonymity she'd maintained throughout her treatment was evaporating in real time. "Ms. Holloway?" A nurse appeared in the waiting room doorway. "We're ready for you." Grace ended the call with Jonas and followed the nurse through familiar hallways to the chemotherapy suite. The treatment center had become her second home over the past 6 weeks, a place where illness was normal, where fighting for your life was just Tuesday morning routine. Her usual chair was available, the one by the window overlooking the medical center's small garden. As the IV line was inserted and the first medications began flowing into her bloodstream, Grace scrolled through the responses to the news article. The comments section was a battlefield of opinions. "Good for her. Companies can't just throw people away when they get sick. She's probably just looking for a payday. Lawsuits are the new lottery tickets. My sister went through this exact same thing. These corporations have no souls." Maybe if she'd been more dedicated to her job instead of looking for excuses. Grace stopped reading. The casual cruelty of strangers dissecting her medical crisis felt like a secondary illness, spreading through her phone screen and into her bloodstream alongside the chemotherapy drugs. Her phone rang again. Marina Campos. "Ms. Holloway, thanks you for taking my call. I know this must be an overwhelming day." Marina's voice was warm but direct, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating crisis. "I'm a disability rights advocate here in Sacramento, and I'm also a breast cancer survivor. I went through treatment 3 years ago." "Oh." Grace felt some of her defensiveness ease. "I'm sorry. I mean, don't apologize. And don't say you're sorry I had cancer. Say you're glad I survived it. There was humor in Marina's voice, but also steel. Because survival is what this is about. Not just medical survival, social survival, economic survival, the survival of your dignity, and your right to exist as a full human being. Grace glanced around the chemotherapy suite, at the other patients in their recliners, IV lines connecting them to bags of life-saving poison. I never wanted to be a poster child for anything. None of us do. But sometimes the system forces you into a position where you have to choose between being a victim or being a warrior. Marina paused. The question is, what kind of warrior do you want to be? I just want my life back. Your old life is gone, Grace. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because accepting that reality is the first step toward building something better. Marina's voice softened slightly. The woman who gets fired for having cancer can never go back to being the woman who believed corporations cared about their employees. But she can become the woman who changes the system for everyone who comes after her. Grace watched a sparrow land on the garden windowsill, its tiny head cocked as it studied her through the glass. What are you asking me to do? Let me help you tell your story. Not to the media, not yet, but to the people who need to hear it. Other workers facing discrimination, advocacy groups, policymakers. Marina's passion was evident even through the phone. Your lawsuit is just the beginning. Real change happens when individual cases become movements. I don't know anything about movements. You know about injustice. You know about fighting for your life while other people reduce you to metrics. And liability assessments. That's more than enough to start with. Grace's IV pump beeped softly, marking another increment of treatment completed. Around her, other patients dozed or read or stared out windows, each fighting their own private battles while connected to machines that offered hope mixed with suffering. There's something else, Marina continued. I've been tracking cases, like yours across the region. Technova isn't the only company pulling these tactics. There's a pattern emerging: diagnose and discard. Cancer patients, chronic illness, even pregnancy discrimination disguised as performance issues. The sparrow on the windowsill was joined by another, then another. Grace watched them huddle together against the November cold, finding strength in proximity. So this is bigger than just me. Much bigger. But individual cases like yours are how we expose systematic problems. They're how we turn corporate policies into public scrutiny. Grace's phone buzzed with another notification, this time from Facebook, where Eli had shared the news article. Already, there were dozens of comments from friends, colleagues, acquaintances expressing shock, support, and various levels of outrage. I had no idea this happened to you. Sue them into bankruptcy. You're so brave for speaking out. Brave. The word felt foreign applied to her circumstances. She wasn't brave, she was cornered, fighting back because the alternative was accepting systematic cruelty as normal business practice. Marina, Grace said slowly, if I do this, if I let you help me make this bigger, what does that look like? It looks like speaking at conferences, connecting with other survivors, working with legislators on policy changes. It looks like becoming someone who uses her experience to protect other people from going through what you're going through. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of possibility and responsibility settling over her like a blanket. The quiet life she'd planned, surviving treatment, returning to work, rebuilding her career, was already impossible. Technova had made sure of that with their termination email. But maybe Marina was right. Maybe the choice wasn't between victim and survivor, but between victim and warrior. Okay, Grace said quietly. Let's talk. As Marina began outlining her organization's resources and connections, Grace watched the sparrows outside her window. They'd formed a small flock now, 8 or 9 birds finding warmth and protection in numbers. Individual cases become movements, Marina had said. Grace was beginning to understand what that meant. Not just legal precedent, but community. Not just personal justice, but systematic change. The chemotherapy dripped steadily into her bloodstream, fighting the cancer that had upended her life. But for the first time since her diagnosis, Grace felt like she was fighting something bigger than disease. She was fighting for a world where illness didn't make you disposable, where humanity mattered more than productivity metrics. Her phone buzzed with another message from someone she didn't recognize. "Thank you for fighting back. My husband was fired during his heart attack recovery. We need more people like you." Grace stared at the message, understanding with sudden clarity that her private battle had become public the moment Technova decided her life was worth less than their quarterly numbers. Now it was time to make them pay for that calculation. The encrypted email arrived in Jonas's inbox at 3:47 a.m., sender unknown, subject line blank. He'd learned to pay attention to messages that tried so hard to be invisible. The attachment was a single PDF, a company memo dated 18 months prior, marked Confidential Executive Review Only. Jonas read it twice before allowing himself to believe what he was seeing. Product safety concerns, immediate action. Required internal testing has identified potential cardiovascular risks in extended use scenarios. Recommend temporary market withdrawal pending further analysis. Legal advises documentation of all safety protocols to demonstrate due diligence. Dr. Sarah Chen, Chief Medical Officer below. Chen's recommendation, a handwritten note in the margin, not viable. Launch proceeds as scheduled. Contain this internally. B.K. Jonas's hands trembled slightly as he screenshot the document, then printed 3 copies. B.K. Bryce Kellerman, the CEO. The same man who'd testified under oath that no safety concerns had ever been raised internally. By 8 a.m., Jonas was on the phone with his co-counsel. "We need to move fast. If this is legitimate..." "It's legitimate," said Patricia Rowe, his senior partner. "I've got contacts who can verify the metadata. The question is, are you ready for..." "What comes next?" Jonas looked across his cramped office at the wall of case files, each representing someone whose life had been derailed by corporate negligence. Grace Martinez's photo sat prominently among them, a reminder of why he'd chosen this path. "I'm ready." The call to Meridian Dynamics' legal department came at 10:15 a.m. Jonas kept his voice level, professional. "This is Jonas Chen representing the plaintiffs in Martinez versus Meridian Dynamics. I'm calling to inform you that we've obtained documentary evidence of your client's knowledge of safety risks prior to product launch. We're prepared to file a motion for sanctions based on perjury in previous depositions." The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "I'll need to consult with our client," the corporate lawyer finally said. "You have 48 hours to respond with a settlement offer that reflects the gravity of this situation. After that, we're going public." Jonas hung up and immediately called Grace. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anxiety. "What does this mean?" she asked after he explained. "It means we have them. This document proves they knew about the risks and chose to hide them. It changes everything." "But how did you get it?" Jonas hesitated. The truth was, he had no idea. The email had come from an encrypted account that bounced through multiple servers. Someone inside Meridian had decided to do the right thing, but at considerable personal risk. "Someone with a conscience," he said finally. 15 miles across the city, Hannah Reeves sat in her locked office, staring at her computer screen, with a mixture of terror and relief. The news alert had just popped up. Major development expected in Meridian Dynamics lawsuit. She'd done it. After months of sleepless nights and moral wrestling, she'd finally acted. The memo she'd discovered while digitizing old executive files had been eating at her for weeks. Dr. Chen's warning, Kellerman's dismissive response, it was everything Jonas Chen needed to prove the company's guilt. But sending it anonymously hadn't lessened her fear. Kellerman was already conducting a witch hunt, demanding IT logs and questioning anyone with access to sensitive documents. It was only a matter of time before they traced it back to her. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. Saw the news. "You okay?" Hannah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to tell someone, to share the weight of what she'd done. But not yet. Not until she was sure Grace Martinez would get justice. "Just busy with work. Talk soon." She deleted the text thread and got back to pretending everything was normal. At Meridian Dynamics headquarters, the executive conference room had become a war room. Bryce Kellerman paced behind the polished table while his legal team scrambled to assess the damage. "How the hell did they get this?" Kellerman demanded, slapping the leaked memo down on the table. "This was executive level only. We had maybe 12 people with access." "We're conducting a full internal investigation," said the head of security. "It is pulling server logs, email records, everything." "What about Chen, the CMO who wrote this?" The legal team exchanged glances. "She left the company 6 months after this memo. Clean resignation, moved to a competitor. We can try to discredit her, claim she had an axe to grind." Kellerman shook his head. "The damage is done. The question is how we contain it." "We could settle," suggested the general counsel tentatively. "Cut our losses, keep it quiet." "Absolutely not." Kellerman's voice was steel. "We settle this. We admit guilt. Every other plaintiff will come crawling out of the woodwork. We fight this in court, and we win. Sir, with respect, this document is out of context." Chen was being overly cautious, as medical officers tend to be. "We did additional testing, resolved the concerns, proceeded appropriately. That's our story." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what Kellerman was really saying. They were doubling down on the lie. Grace stood in front of the bathroom, mirror in Marina's office, adjusting the collar of her navy blazer. Tomorrow's deposition would be crucial. Jonas had warned her that Meridian's lawyers would be more aggressive than ever, desperate to discredit her testimony. "You look professional but approachable," Marina said, appearing behind her. "Remember, the goal isn't just to tell your story. It's to make them see you as a person, not just another case number." Grace nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. "What if they ask about my medical history? The depression, the anxiety?" "We've prepared for that. Your mental health struggles are a direct result of what happened to you. They're part of your damages, not something to be ashamed of. Jonas thinks they might try to claim I was predisposed to cardiac issues." Marina's expression hardened. "Then we show them the timeline. Healthy 26-year-old woman? No. Family history. Perfect cardiac screening just months before using their product. The correlation is undeniable." Grace turned from the mirror. Over the past months, Marina had become more than a PR consultant. She was a friend, a strategist, and sometimes the only person who truly understood the weight of what Grace was carrying. "I keep thinking about all the other people out there," Grace said quietly. "People who might be going through what I went through, but don't know why. Don't know it wasn't their fault. That's exactly why we're doing this. Your courage could save lives, Grace. Don't let them make you forget that." Jonas spent the evening in his office, preparing for what he knew would be the most important case of his career. The leaked memo had given them leverage, but Meridian's refusal to settle meant they were heading to trial against one of the most well-funded legal teams in the country. His phone rang at 11 p.m. Unknown number. "Mr. Chen? This is Dr. Sarah Chen. I understand you have some questions about a memo I wrote." Jonas nearly dropped the phone. The former CMO, the woman whose warning had been ignored, was calling him directly. "Dr. Chen, yes, we have several questions." "I can't testify," she said immediately. "My current employer has a non-compete clause, and I can't risk my position. But I can tell you this. Every word in that memo was accurate. The risks were real, the data was clear, and they chose profits over patient safety. Would you be willing to provide an affidavit? Something we could use in court? A long pause. Send me the paperwork. I'll consider it. The line went dead. Jonas sat back in his chair, heart racing. Between the leaked memo, Dr. Chen's potential, cooperation, and Grace's compelling personal story, they might actually have a chance. But he knew Meridian wouldn't go down without a fight. Tomorrow's deposition would be just the beginning of a battle that would test everyone involved. Grace's resilience, his own legal skills, and the courage of the person who'd risked everything to send him that memo. The truth was finally coming to light. Now they had to prove it was stronger than corporate power and unlimited legal resources. In offices across the city, 4 people prepared for a war that would change all their lives. Grace steeling herself to face her tormentors, Jonas crafting the legal strategy that could bring down a corporate giant, Marina planning the media campaign that would expose the truth, and Hannah wondering if she'd have the courage to step out of the shadows when the time came. The trial was 2 weeks away. The real fight was just beginning. The deposition room felt smaller than Grace remembered, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the polished conference table. Across from her sat 3 corporate lawyers in identical navy suits, their expressions carefully neutral as they arranged their files with military precision. Jonas squeezed her shoulder. Remember what we practiced. Answer only what they ask. Don't volunteer information. Grace nodded, her mouth dry despite the water glass in front of her. The court reporter adjusted her machine, fingers poised over the keys that would capture every word of what Grace knew would be a brutal interrogation. Ms. Martinez, began the lead counsel, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Walsh. You've claimed our client's product caused your cardiac episode. Are you aware that anxiety and depression can manifest as physical symptoms, including chest pain and shortness of breath? Objection, Jonas interjected. Relevance? I'll allow it, said the mediator. Grace straightened her shoulders. I know the difference between anxiety and a heart attack, Ms. Walsh. I was in the ICU for 3 days. But you were taking antidepressants at the time, weren't you? After the incident, yes. Because my life was turned upside down by... Just answer the question, please. Grace felt the old familiar tightness in her chest, but this time it wasn't panic. It was anger. Yes, I was prescribed medication after your client's product nearly killed me. Walsh's smile was razor thin. Nearly killed you? That's quite dramatic. The medical records show you were discharged after routine observation. Routine? Grace's voice rose despite herself. I couldn't work for months. I can't exercise like I used to. I live in constant fear that it might happen again. Fear, Walsh repeated, making a note. Would you say you're a fearful person in general, Ms. Martinez? Jonas half rose from his chair. Objection. This is harassment. But Grace was done, being afraid. The months of preparation, Marina's coaching, and her own growing confidence crystallized into something unshakable. I wasn't fearful, she said evenly, until your client decided my life was worth less than their profit margins. 2 floors above, Hannah Reeves stood at her office window, watching news vans gather in the parking lot below. The story had exploded overnight. Jonas had kept his promise to go public, and every major outlet was running pieces about Meridian's cover-up. Her computer chimed with another urgent email from Kellerman's office. All employees report immediately to HR for interviews regarding the document leak. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination. Hannah's hands shook as she deleted the message. They were closing in, systematically questioning everyone with access to the executive files. Her colleague Mark had already been called in that morning and emerged 20 minutes later looking shaken. She thought about Grace Martinez, probably facing down Meridian's lawyers at this very moment. The woman deserved better than corporate cowardice. Hannah opened her desk drawer and pulled out a flash drive, her insurance policy, everything she'd found while digitizing files, memos, emails, internal safety reports that had been buried. Enough evidence to bury Kellerman and his entire executive team. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. "Saw the news about your company. What a mess. Glad you're just in IT." Just in IT. Hannah almost laughed. If only she knew. Another email. Arrived, this one directly from Kellerman. "Hannah, need to see you in my office. 2 p.m. BK." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. They knew. Jonas watched the news coverage from the courthouse lobby, his phone buzzing constantly with calls from reporters and other attorneys smelling blood in the water. The leaked memo had done more than give them leverage. It had sparked a media firestorm that Meridian couldn't control. "Grace did well in there," Patricia said, joining him near the windows. "Walsh tried to rattle her, but she held strong." "She's stronger than she knows," Jonas replied. "But this is just the beginning. They'll come at us harder during trial." "About that." Patricia's expression grew serious. "I got a call from Meridian's board. They want to discuss settlement." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "Kellerman said no. Yesterday." "Kellerman's not making decisions anymore. The board is panicking. Stock price dropped 15% since the story broke, and 3 major institutional investors have pulled their support." Jonas felt a familiar conflict. Settlement would mean compensation for Grace and the other plaintiffs, but it would also mean Meridian could bury the truth under a non-disclosure agreement. No accountability, no systemic change. What are they offering? Enough to make this go away quietly. Grace would never have to work again. Jonas thought about his conversation with Grace months ago, her determination to prevent others from suffering as she had. Money alone wouldn't accomplish that. "Set up the meeting," he said finally. "But make it clear. Any settlement includes public admission of wrongdoing and removal of Kellerman from leadership. This isn't just about money anymore." At 2 p.m. sharp, Hannah knocked on Kellerman's office door. He looked up from his computer, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie slightly askew. "Hannah, sit down." She perched on the edge of the leather chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Interesting situation we find ourselves in," Kellerman said, leaning back. Someone with access to sensitive documents decided to play whistleblower. Someone who thinks they understand the bigger picture but really doesn't. Hannah's mouth felt like cotton. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "The thing about digital files, Hannah, is they leave traces. Server logs, access records, timestamps." His smile was cold. "IT pulled everything this morning. Very interesting pattern of document access from your login credentials." The room spun slightly. Hannah gripped the chair arms to steady herself. "Now, I could have security escort you out right now. Could have our lawyers pursue criminal charges for corporate espionage. Could make sure you never work in this industry. Again." Hannah's vision blurred, but somewhere beneath the terror, she felt something else stirring. The same resolve that had made her send that memo in the first place. "Or," Kellerman continued, "we can handle this quietly. You sign a settlement agreement, take a generous severance package, and disappear. Clean slate for everyone." Hannah looked at this man who'd built an empire on other people's suffering, who'd looked at Dr. Chen's warning and chosen profit over human life. She thought about Grace Martinez fighting alone in that deposition room, about all the patients who didn't know their symptoms weren't their fault. "No," she said quietly. Kellerman's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" Hannah stood up, surprised by her own steadiness. "I said no. Do whatever you want, Mr. Kellerman. The truth is already out there." She turned toward the door, her legs somehow carrying her forward despite the earthquake in her chest. "Hannah." Kellerman's voice stopped, her at the threshold. "You have no idea what you've just done to yourself." She looked back at him, this powerful man reduced to threats and intimidation. For the first time in months, Hannah smiled. "Actually," she said, "I know exactly what I've done." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Hannah Reeves walked toward whatever came next, finally free. The Meridian Dynamics boardroom had never felt smaller. 12 executives sat around the mahogany table while their stock price continued its freefall on the monitors lining the walls. The emergency board meeting had been called after Hannah Reeves walked into the FBI field office that morning with a flash drive containing 2 years' worth of internal documents. "We're hemorrhaging money," said board member Elizabeth Norton, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. 3 class action suits filed in the past 48 hours. The FDA is launching a formal investigation, and now we have a federal criminal probe. Kellerman sat at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence diminished. "This is temporary, market overreaction. We weather the storm and—" "Bryce." Norton's interruption was ice cold. "You lied to this board. You assured us there were no safety concerns when we approved the expanded marketing campaign. I made business decisions based on available data. You ignored your own chief medical officer's warnings." Norton slid a printed email across the table, one of dozens Hannah had provided to investigators. "Dr. Chen recommended halting distribution pending safety review. Your response was to fire her and bury the report." The room erupted in crosstalk, voices rising as board members demanded answers. Through the chaos, Kellerman's assistant slipped in and whispered urgently in his ear. His face went ashen. "What now?" Norton demanded. Kellerman cleared his throat. "Hannah Reeves has agreed to testify for the plaintiffs. She's scheduled for a press conference this afternoon." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace stood in Marina's office, watching the news coverage with a mixture of vindication and disbelief. Every channel was running the story. Meridian whistleblower exposes cover-up. Internal documents reveal corporate deception. FDA launches criminal investigation. "I can't believe she came forward," Grace said, studying the photo of Hannah. Reeves that kept appearing on screen. A slight woman with kind eyes who'd risked everything to do the right thing. Marina adjusted the lighting for their own press conference, scheduled for an hour after Hannah's. She knew what it would cost her. That makes it even braver. Jonas burst through the door, phone pressed to his ear, his face flushed with excitement. "Patricia, that's incredible. Yes, I'll take it." He hung up and turned to them, grinning. "Meridian's board just voted. Kellerman's out, effective immediately." Grace felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anger she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Really? Really. And that's not all. They want to settle. Full admission of liability, public apology, and compensation that. He paused, studying Grace's face. "It's enough to change your life, Grace. More than enough." For a moment, Grace allowed herself to imagine it. Financial security, vindication, the ability to move forward without the constant stress of litigation. But then she thought about Hannah Reeves, sacrificing her career for the truth. What about the others? The people who don't know their symptoms are connected to Meridian's product? Marina stepped forward. "That's why we're not just taking the settlement. We're making sure the story gets told completely. Every detail, every cover-up, every patient who deserves to know the truth." The FBI field office conference room was cramped but functional. Hannah sat across from Special Agent Sarah Williams, a stack of documents between them that represented the dismantling of everything Kellerman had built. "You understand the risks you're taking," Agent Williams said gently. "Testifying against your former employer, especially in a case this high profile, there will be consequences." Hannah nodded. She'd already received 3 threatening phone calls and had to change her hotel twice. "I understand. Why now? You could have stayed." "Quiet. Let someone else fight this battle." Hannah thought about Grace Martinez, a woman she'd never met but whose courage had inspired her own. Because staying quiet makes you complicit. I've been complicit long enough. Agent Williams made a note. Tell me about the systematic destruction of documents you mentioned. It started right after the first lawsuit was filed. Kellerman ordered all safety-related communications to be archived, which was corporate speak for deleted. I was supposed to digitize the files for long-term storage, but instead I made copies. How many documents are we talking about? Over 3,000. Emails, memos, test results, safety reports. Everything they tried to hide. Hannah pulled out her phone and showed the agent a screenshot of an email chain from 18 months earlier. This one's particularly damning. Kellerman explicitly instructed the legal team to deny the existence of internal safety concerns in discovery responses. Agent Williams studied the screen. That's perjury and obstruction of justice. I know. Hannah's voice was steady now, strengthened by purpose. That's why I'm here. The press conference was chaos. Reporters shouted questions while camera flashes turned the hotel ballroom into a strobing nightmare. Grace sat at the center table, flanked by Jonas and Marina, facing the largest media gathering she'd ever seen. Ms. Martinez, called a reporter from the front row, how do you respond to Meridian's claim that you're seeking undeserved compensation for pre-existing conditions? Grace leaned forward to the microphone. I respond by pointing to the evidence. Hannah Reeves risked her career to reveal documents proving Meridian knew their product was dangerous. Dr. Chen, their own chief medical officer, warned them to stop distribution. They chose profits over patient safety. What do you want people to know who might be experiencing similar symptoms? Grace paused, thinking of all the messages she'd received from strangers describing their own mysterious cardiac episodes, their own confusion and fear. I want them to know they're not alone, that what happened to them might not be their fault, and that it's okay to demand answers from companies that put products in our bodies. Another reporter. Do you plan to accept Meridian's settlement offer? Jonas squeezed her shoulder. They'd discussed this moment extensively. We're considering all options, Grace said carefully. But any resolution must include accountability, not just financial compensation, but acknowledgement of wrongdoing and changes to prevent this from happening to others. One final question, called a reporter from the back. What would you say to Hannah Reeves? Grace looked directly into the camera, knowing Hannah was probably watching somewhere. Thank you. Thank you for your courage, for caring more about strangers than your own security. You saved lives today. In her hotel room across town, Hannah watched Grace's press conference with tears streaming down her face. Her phone buzzed. Constantly. Job offers from competing companies, interview requests from journalists, messages of support from strangers. She'd lost her career, her financial stability, probably her ability to work in the pharmaceutical industry again. But watching Grace Martinez speak with such strength and clarity, seeing the investigation unfold that would finally hold Kellerman accountable, it felt worth it. Her phone rang. Unknown number, which usually meant another threat or harassment. Call. She almost didn't answer. Hannah? This is Dr. Sarah Chen. Hannah sat up straighter. Dr. Chen? How did you get this number? I have my ways. I wanted to thank you. What you did took incredible courage. You tried to warn them first. I just finished what you started. No, Dr. Chen's voice was firm. You did something I couldn't. You chose truth over career, over safety, over everything they use to keep us quiet. That's heroism, Hannah. After the call ended, Hannah sat in the gathering darkness, processing the enormity of what she'd set in motion. Tomorrow would bring depositions, testimony, more threats. But tonight, for the first time in months, she slept peacefully. The truth was finally free. The federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles had become a media circus. News vans lined the street. Reporters thrust microphones at anyone who looked remotely connected to the case, and protesters carried signs reading, Corporate Accountability Now, and Justice for Grace. Inside courtroom 14A, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Grace sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands steady now despite the magnitude of the moment. After months of preparation, the criminal trial of Bryce Kellerman and 3 other Meridian executives was finally beginning. Jonas leaned over to whisper, "Remember, this isn't just about civil damages anymore. The DOJ is prosecuting criminal fraud charges. Your testimony could send him to prison." Grace nodded, watching as Kellerman was led to the defendant's table in handcuffs, a powerful man reduced to an orange jumpsuit and shackles. His empire had crumbled in spectacular fashion, stock price down 67%, FDA recall of all Meridian cardiac products, and congressional hearings scheduled for next month. "All rise," called the bailiff. The Honorable Judge Patricia Hernandez presiding. In the witness gallery, Hannah Reeves sat between her sister and a victim's advocate, trying to control her nerves. She'd already given 8 hours of testimony to the grand jury, but today would be different. Today, she'd face Kellerman directly. Her phone buzzed with a text from her new attorney. "Remember, you have immunity. Tell the truth. Trust the process." The truth. Such a simple concept that had cost her everything and given her everything back. Since coming forward, she'd received death threats and job offers in equal measure. 3 major pharmaceutical companies had reached out about compliance positions. Apparently, whistleblowing was becoming a marketable skill, but none of that mattered as much as seeing Grace Martinez walk into that courtroom with her head held high. Assistant District Attorney Michael Rodriguez stood to deliver his opening statement, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a simple choice: profits or people. The evidence will show that the defendants knew their product was dangerous, that they received explicit warnings from their own medical staff, and that they chose to prioritize their bottom line over human lives." He gestured toward a large screen displaying the leaked memo. Dr. Sarah Chen, Meridian's chief medical officer, wrote these words: "Internal testing has identified potential cardiovascular risks. Recommend temporary market withdrawal pending further analysis." The defendant's response was not to investigate further or warn patients. Their response was to fire Dr. Chen and destroy evidence. Grace watched the jury's faces, seeing the disgust and anger she'd felt for so long reflected in their expressions. "Over the next week," Rodriguez continued, "you'll hear from Hannah Reeves, a former Meridian employee who risked her career to expose the truth. You'll hear from Dr. Chen, who was silenced for trying to protect patients, and you'll hear from Grace Martinez, whose life was forever changed by the defendant's callous disregard for human safety." Rodriguez paused, letting his words sink in. This isn't just about one company or one product. This is about whether corporations can lie to patients, hide dangers, and escape accountability. Your verdict will send a message that will echo through every boardroom in America. Kellerman's defense attorney, Harold Morrison, rose with practiced calm. He was expensive, $2,000 an hour expensive, and it showed in his tailored suit and confident demeanor. "My client is not the villain the prosecution wants you to believe," Morrison began. "Bryce Kellerman is a dedicated businessman who spent his career developing products that helped millions of people. The prosecution wants to criminalize business decisions, to punish success, to ignore the fact that all medical products carry some level of risk." Grace felt her jaw clench. Even now, even facing federal prison, they were still trying to minimize what they'd done. "Dr. Chen's memo was one opinion among many," Morrison continued. "Mr. Kellerman sought additional testing, consulted with experts, and made a reasonable business decision based on the totality of evidence. The prosecution has cherry-picked documents to create a narrative of conspiracy where none exists." Jonas scribbled a note and slid it to Grace. "Classic defense strategy. Don't let it get to you." But Grace was beyond being rattled. She'd spent too many sleepless nights, too many therapy sessions, too many moments wondering if she was losing her mind to be intimidated by corporate spin anymore. When Hannah took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She'd lost 20 pounds since coming forward, her face gaunt with stress, but her voice was steady as she raised her right hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." Rodriguez approached the witness stand. "Ms. Reeves, please tell the jury about your employment with Meridian Dynamics." "I worked in IT for 6 years, specializing in document management and digital archiving. Part of my job was maintaining and organizing executive communications." "Did you have access to sensitive company documents?" "Yes. Email archives, memos, safety reports, anything that needed to be digitized for long-term storage." "What did you discover during this process?" Hannah looked directly at Kellerman, who stared back with undisguised hatred. "I discovered a systematic pattern of ignoring safety warnings and hiding evidence from regulators and patients." Morrison objected, but Judge Hernandez allowed the testimony to continue. "Can you describe the document that led you to contact the FBI?" Hannah's voice strengthened. It was an email chain from March 2023. Dr. Chen had sent a detailed safety report recommending immediate product recall. Mr. Kellerman's response was to instruct the legal team to deny the existence of any safety concerns in their discovery responses to ongoing litigation. "What did you do with this information?" "Initially, nothing. I was scared. I needed my job, and I knew the consequences of crossing Mr. Kellerman." Hannah's voice cracked slightly. "But then I saw Grace Martinez on the news talking about her symptoms, and I realized my silence was making me complicit in harming innocent people." Rodriguez displayed the leaked memo on the courtroom screens. "Is this the document you provided to plaintiff's counsel?" "Yes, along with over 3,000 other documents that Meridian tried to destroy." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Hernandez gavelled for order. "Ms. Reeves," Rodriguez continued, "why did you risk your career to expose this information?" Hannah looked out at the gallery, finding Grace's encouraging smile. "Because sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but doing nothing costs even more." When Morrison began his cross-examination, his tone was sharp and accusatory. "Ms. Reeves, isn't it true that you were facing performance issues at Meridian?" "No, that's not true." "Didn't you receive a negative performance review 6 months before you stole confidential documents?" Jonas shot to his feet. "Objection." "Assumes facts, not an evidence." "Sustained." Morrison tried again. "You were passed over for promotion twice in 2 years, weren't you?" "Yes, but that had nothing to do with—" "So you had a grudge against the company, a motivation for revenge." Hannah's composure finally cracked. "My motivation was watching Grace Martinez's interview and realizing that dozens of other people might be suffering because I stayed quiet. My motivation was reading Dr. Chen's warnings and seeing how they were ignored. My motivation was basic human decency." The courtroom fell silent. Even Morrison seemed taken aback by her passion. "No further questions," he said quietly. Grace's testimony came on the 3rd day. She'd dreaded this moment for months, facing cross-examination about her most vulnerable experiences, having her credibility attacked, her suffering minimized. But as she walked to the witness stand, she felt something she hadn't expected: peace. The truth was finally being told, completely and publicly. Whatever happened next, she'd done everything she could. Rodriguez led her through her story: the sudden onset of symptoms, the terrifying emergency room visits, the months of uncertainty and fear. Grace spoke clearly, directly, without drama or embellishment. "How has this experience changed your life, Ms. Martinez?" Grace looked at the jury, seeing faces that reflected her own journey: confusion, anger, determination. It taught me that sometimes the people we trust to keep us safe are the ones putting us in danger. It taught me that speaking up isn't easy, but it's necessary. And it taught me that one person's courage can give others permission to be brave. She glanced at Hannah, who was wiping away tears in the gallery. Most importantly, it taught me that my life, all our lives, have value beyond what any corporation's balance sheet can measure. When Morrison began his cross-examination, he tried to paint Grace as opportunistic, seeking financial gain from a coincidental medical event. But Grace had been preparing for this attack for months. "Mr. Morrison, I was a healthy 26-year-old woman before I used your client's product. I had no cardiac history, no family history, no risk factors. The timeline is clear, the medical evidence is clear, and now thanks to Hannah Reeves, the corporate cover-up is clear. The only thing that's unclear is how your client sleeps at night." Morrison objected, but the damage was done. The jury had heard enough. The verdict came after just 6 hours of deliberation. As the foreman stood to read the decision, the courtroom held its collective breath. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant Bryce Kellerman guilty." The courtroom erupted. Grace felt Jonas's hand squeeze her shoulder as reporters scrambled for their phones. At the defendant's table, Kellerman's face remained impassive, but his hand shook as he gripped the table edge. "On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of endangering public safety, guilty." Judge Hernandez called for order, but the celebration was unstoppable. Years of corporate arrogance had finally met its reckoning. As court officials led Kellerman away in handcuffs, he turned back to look at Grace one final time. Instead of the intimidation he'd once wielded so effectively, she saw only a broken man who'd gambled with human lives and lost everything. Outside the courthouse, Grace stood with Hannah and Jonas, facing the largest media gathering any of them had ever seen. The questions came rapid fire, but Grace felt ready for all of them. "Ms. Martinez, what's next for you?" Grace smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Healing, and making sure this never happens to anyone else. The truth had won. Finally, completely, and publicly. Justice had been served. 6 months later, the Grace Martinez Foundation occupied a modest suite on the 15th floor of a downtown Los Angeles office building, its walls lined with thank you letters from patients who'd finally gotten answers about their mysterious symptoms. Grace stood at the window, watching the morning traffic flow through the city below, still sometimes amazed by how much her life had changed. "The morning briefing is ready," called Hannah from the conference room. As the Foundation's director of transparency initiatives, Hannah had thrown herself into the work of holding pharmaceutical companies accountable with the same dedication she'd once brought to covering up their crimes. Grace smiled and joined the small but passionate team they'd assembled. Marina had left her PR firm to become the Foundation's communications director. Jonas served on the board while maintaining his law practice, and Dr. Sarah Chen had joined as chief medical advisor after Meridian's bankruptcy freed her from non-compete restrictions. "What's on the agenda?" Grace asked, settling into her chair with a cup of coffee that no longer made her heart race. A small victory she celebrated. Daily, Hannah consulted her tablet. 3 new whistleblower cases, 2 from former pharma employees and 1 from a medical device company. The congressional hearing on corporate transparency legislation is next week. They want you to testify again. And we've got 47 new patient inquiries from people who think their symptoms might be connected to undisclosed product risks. Grace nodded. Each number represented a human story, a life disrupted by corporate negligence. The Foundation had already helped connect over 300 patients with attorneys and medical experts, facilitating settlements totaling $180 million. But more importantly, they'd forced 5 major recalls and 3 CEO resignations. "Any word on the Kellerman sentencing?" Dr. Chen asked. "Next Friday," Jonas said. joining the meeting via video call from his car. 7 to 10 years, most likely. The judge made it clear she wants to send a message about corporate accountability. Grace felt a complex mix of emotions about Kellerman's fate. Justice demanded consequences, but she'd moved beyond personal revenge. Her focus now was preventing future victims, not punishing past perpetrators. "There's something else," Marina said, pulling up a news article on the main screen. PharmaCorp just announced they're implementing a new voluntary safety reporting system. Full transparency on adverse events, independent safety boards, and quarterly public reports. "That's the fourth major company this year," Hannah noted with satisfaction. "The Meridian effect is real." The Meridian effect, that's what industry analysts had dubbed the wave of voluntary reforms sweeping through pharmaceutical companies. Rather than wait for regulation, many were proactively adopting transparency measures to avoid becoming the next cautionary tale. After the meeting, Grace found herself alone with Hannah in the break room, a daily ritual that had become one of her favorite parts of the workday. "Any regrets?" Grace asked, a question they'd discussed many times over the past months. Hannah considered it seriously, as she always did. "About coming forward? Never. About the career I lost? Sometimes. But then I think about letters like this." She pulled out a handwritten note from her folder. It's from a woman in Phoenix whose daughter started having cardiac episodes after using a Meridian product. She said our foundation helped her connect the dots and get proper treatment. How do you put a price on that? Grace smiled. "You don't. That's the point." They'd both learned to live with uncertainty. Hannah was still rebuilding her career. Grace was still managing ongoing health issues. But they'd also discovered something more valuable than the security they'd lost. Purpose that aligned with their values. "The FBI called this morning," Hannah said quietly. "They want me to consult on another case. A medical device company that might be covering up surgical complications. Will you do it? Probably, though I never thought I'd become a professional. Corporate spy." Hannah laughed, but her expression grew serious. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm addicted to the fight now. Like I can't just live a normal life anymore." Grace understood the feeling. The foundation work was fulfilling but consuming. Every day brought new evidence of corporate malfeasance, new victims seeking help, new battles to fight. It would be easy to burn out trying to fix everything. "Maybe that's okay," Grace said finally. "Maybe some fights are worth being addicted to." That evening, Grace drove to her parents' house in Pasadena for their weekly dinner. The routine had become precious to her, a reminder of the simple relationships that anchored her life amid the chaos of public advocacy. Her mother, Elena, was setting the table when Grace arrived. "Mija, you look tired. Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, Mommy." Grace kissed her mother's cheek, inhaling the familiar scent of garlic and cumin from the kitchen. "Just busy." Her father, Carlos, emerged from his study where he'd been following the foundation's work with the dedication of a proud parent. "I saw the interview you did with CNN. Very good. You're becoming quite the public speaker." Grace laughed. "Remember when I was too shy to order pizza over the phone?" "That girl is still in there," Elena said, touching Grace's face gently. "But she's stronger now, wiser." During dinner, they talked about ordinary things. Her cousin's wedding, her father's retirement plans, her mother's garden. Grace treasured these conversations that had nothing to do with corporate corruption or patient advocacy. They reminded her that healing wasn't just about fighting injustice. It was about rebuilding the capacity for simple joy. "There's something I want to tell you both," Grace said as they cleared the dishes. "I've been seeing someone." Her parents exchanged glances. They'd worried about her isolation, her focus on work to the exclusion of personal relationships. "Tell us about him," Elena said, settling back at the table with fresh coffee. "Her name is Alex. She's a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital. We met at a healthcare advocacy conference last month. Grace watched her parents process this information. She'd dated men before Meridian, but the trauma and subsequent legal battle had given her space to examine aspects of herself she'd never fully explored. She sounds wonderful, Carlos said simply. When do we meet her? Grace felt tears prick her eyes. After everything they'd been through together, the medical crisis, the legal battle, the media attention, her parents' unconditional love remained her greatest source of strength. Soon, she promised. She's excited to meet you both. Later. That night, Grace sat in her apartment reviewing patient testimonials for the Foundation's annual report. Each story was different: cardiac episodes like hers, mysterious neurological symptoms, unexplained autoimmune reactions, but they shared common threads: confusion, fear, and the relief of finally having answers. Her phone buzzed with a text. From Alex. How was dinner with your parents? Grace smiled, typing back. Perfect. They want to meet you. Terrifying and wonderful. I'm ready when you are. The relationship was still new, still tentative. Alex understood Grace's commitment to the Foundation work, but also challenged her to maintain balance, to remember that healing trauma required more than fighting its source. Grace was learning to navigate this balance between advocacy and self-care, between justice and forgiveness, between the public figure she'd become and the private person she remained. Her laptop chimed with an email from Jonas. FYI, Meridian's bankruptcy proceedings finalized today. All assets liquidated. Victims' fund fully funded. It's officially over. Grace stared at the message for a long moment. Meridian Dynamics, the company that had nearly destroyed her life, no longer existed. Kellerman was in federal prison. The other executives had been banned from working in pharmaceuticals. The victims, herself included, had received compensation that would never fully restore what they'd lost, but would ease their ongoing struggles. Justice, as complete as it ever gets in the real world. She closed her laptop and walked to her bathroom medicine cabinet, where she kept her daily medications, heart, rhythm stabilizers, anxiety management, supplements to support her ongoing recovery. 2 years ago, she'd seen these pills as symbols of her broken body, reminders of corporate betrayal. Now she saw them differently, as tools for living fully despite what had been done to her, evidence of her resilience rather than her victimization. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Grace sat at the witness table alongside Hannah, Dr. Chen, and 3 other whistleblowers from different industries. The Corporate Accountability Act, legislation born directly from the Meridian case, was heading for a final vote. Senator Maria Vasquez, the bill's primary sponsor, called the hearing to order. We're here today to discuss the most comprehensive corporate transparency legislation in American history. Ms. Martinez, as the catalyst for much of this reform, would you like to begin? Grace leaned toward the microphone, looking out at an audience that included corporate lobbyists, patient advocates, journalists, and family members of other victims. 2 years ago, she would have been terrified. Now she felt only purpose. Senators, thank you for this opportunity. When I first experienced cardiac symptoms, I thought something was wrong with me. I never imagined that a corporation had made a calculated decision to put my life at risk for profit. The legislation you're considering today ensures that future patients won't face that confusion, that terror, that sense of betrayal. She gestured to her fellow witnesses. Each person at this table risked everything to expose corporate wrongdoing. Hannah Reeves lost her career. Dr. Chen faced industry blacklisting. Others have endured harassment, lawsuits, and personal destruction. The Corporate Accountability Act would protect people like them and create incentives for companies to police themselves before harm occurs. Senator James Crawford, a known opponent of the legislation, leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, don't you think this bill goes too far? That it could stifle innovation and hurt American competitiveness? Grace had been preparing for this question for months. Senator, I think American competitiveness should be based on creating products that help people rather than hiding products that harm them. Innovation thrives on trust between companies and consumers. That trust is destroyed when corporations lie about safety risks. But the compliance costs are nothing compared to the human costs of cover-ups, Grace interrupted, her voice rising slightly. Meridian spent more money hiding their products' dangers than they would have spent fixing them. This bill simply makes transparency less expensive than deception. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering technical aspects of disclosure, requirements, whistleblower protections, and enforcement mechanisms. But Grace knew the real battle had been won months ago, in courtrooms and newsrooms and congressional offices, where the human story of corporate betrayal had overcome abstract arguments about business flexibility. That evening, Grace stood in the hotel bar overlooking the Capitol Dome, surrounded by advocates, attorneys, and survivors who'd traveled to D.C. for the hearing. The Corporate Accountability Act would pass. They all knew it now. The momentum was unstoppable. Hannah approached with 2 glasses of wine. So what's next for the famous Grace Martinez? Grace accepted the wine gratefully. Honestly, I'm thinking about stepping back a little. The foundation is established, the legislation is passing, other people can carry the torch forward. Retirement at 28? Hannah teased. Not retirement, just balance. Grace thought about Alex, who was back in Los Angeles managing her own career while supporting Grace's advocacy work. I want to have a life that's about more than what was done to me. Any regrets about the path we chose? Grace considered the question seriously. The past 2 years had been exhausting, traumatic, triumphant, and transformative in equal measure. She'd lost her privacy, her sense of safety, her naive faith in corporate responsibility. But she'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that ordinary people could challenge powerful institutions and win. No regrets, she said finally. But I'm ready for the next chapter. Hannah nodded understandingly. I've been thinking the same thing. The FBI offered me a permanent consulting position, but I'm not sure I want to spend my whole career fighting corruption. Maybe it's time to build something instead of just tearing things down. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights twinkle across the Potomac. 2 women who'd found their courage in the darkest moments, who'd learned that justice wasn't something that happened to you, but something you fought for every day. You know what I realized? Grace said. We won, not just in court, not just in Congress, but in the way that matters most. We proved that telling the truth, even when it costs everything, is still worth it. Hannah raised her glass. To telling the truth. To telling the truth, Grace echoed. They clinked glasses as the Capitol Dome gleamed in the distance. A symbol of the democracy they'd helped strengthen through their refusal to stay silent. Tomorrow they'd fly home to resume their lives. Grace to her foundation work and new relationship, Hannah to whatever came next. But tonight, they celebrated not just their victory, but their survival. They'd faced down corporate power, legal, intimidation, and personal destruction. They'd emerged wounded but whole, changed but not broken. The truth had set them free, and in freeing themselves, they'd freed countless others. The story was ending, but the impact would continue for generations. In boardrooms where executives would think twice before hiding safety risks. In regulatory, agencies strengthened by new transparency requirements. In the lives of patients who would receive honest information about the products they trusted with their health. Grace Martinez had started as a victim, become a survivor, and ended as a catalyst for change that would outlive them all. The reckoning was complete, the healing could truly begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to y'all. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.